Hello OTCers, and as we're at the semi-final stage of the UEFA Champions League now, we thought we would look this week at has the balance of power in the competition actually changed, and has significantly changed? I think it has. So we're going to look at some of the big winners and losers in this new format. Now, the biggest and most immediate winner is probably Paris Saint-Germain. Now, I've seen them at first hand a lot of times this season, both in Paris and away from home. I was in Birmingham last week to see them just about survive the Aston Villa experience. And despite that very Champions League flurry where they almost got taken away by Villa in the space of about 10 minutes, they have come a long way in this season's Champions League. And I guess the new format really helped them, because if you go back to the start of the group stage, they weren't getting it right at all. And Luis Enrique has talked a lot about them being a young team who have need of experience, who need to get used to really mastering things at the elite level, despite the talent they obviously have. And we've seen that in their very best matches, particularly against Liverpool over those two games, and against Manchester City, where they blew them away in Paris. But the extended group stage gave them a bit of a chance to get it right, because you think they scored 3 goals in those first 5 games. They were staring down the barrel of a humiliating elimination. It would have been the first time in the QSI era that they would have gone out in the group stage. But I was at the 6th game of their Champions League campaign away at Salzburg, working for TNT there. And that was the night that they really started to get it right. So they started off against quite a weak Salzburg team. Gonzalo Ramos put them in front, but it was really, I think, the last 25 minutes of that game that proved to be the template for them going forward. They brought in Desiree Doué as substitute in that game, and that was the bit where it all really clicked, without a proper centre-forward. And I guess going forward from there, with Ousmane Dembélé as their de facto centre-forward, it's really, really worked. They've been open, they've been exciting, they've been great to watch. Now, we're in a really weird phase, I suppose, for the Champions League. Like we were saying on the Continent podcast last week with Dotun Adebayo and Jonathan Johnson, because you have a lot of teams that are imperfect, which I think tells us a lot about the fact that there's this sort of power vacuum, and we'll talk about some of the losers and some of the reasons for that in a little bit. But one of those others that's been able to come into that power vacuum is Barcelona. Now, of course, Barcelona feel like a big name. It doesn't feel like the changing of the guard in European football at all. But this Barcelona team has been the most faithful to what we consider, I guess, as European football watchers, the best Barcelona, the essence of Barcelona in a really long time. This is the best team they've had, regardless of what happens in the rest of the competition, since the one that won it in 2015 under Luis Enrique, who's obviously now in charge of PSG. Now, Hansi Flick, I think, is a huge part of that. Now, I think it's normal when we look at Barcelona to think of the players, to think of the superstars, Lamine Yamal, and to a lesser extent, even though they've been outstanding this season, Rafinha, Lewandowski, etc., etc., etc. But actually, I think we do have to look at Hansi Flick here, because he has instilled this system, just as he did at Bayern, to get these star players playing without fear of consequence, and playing very freely, and actually quite risky football, which may knock them down actually when we get into the semi-finals and the final. We'll have to wait and see. It certainly leaves them open, and they conceded a lot of chances against Dortmund over the 2 legs, for example, and it could have been closer if Dortmund had taken some of those chances in the first leg of the quarter-final. But it does make Barcelona an absolutely brilliant watch. And funnily enough, even for the extended format of the group stage, they have been pretty consistent in terms of their results the whole way through. So if you were making an argument for them to be favourites for the rest of this competition rather than PSG, that would perhaps be it. Now, when we're talking about big winners from this new Champions League, I think we have to talk about Aston Villa and Arsenal as well. Well, in the case of Arsenal, of course, the fact that they're unexpectedly arriving in the semi-final of the Champions League. I think the extra games have really, really worked for them because, of course, they're kind of finding their way in the Champions League a little bit still. This was the first time in a number of years that they were in the competition last year. They looked ready for it straight away. I was at that first game they played against PSV Eindhoven at the Emirates. There was this huge atmosphere from these fans, so excited that they were back in the Champions League. And funnily enough, the way that they went out of the Champions League, last year when they went out in the quarterfinals to Bayern, there wasn't a lot in it score-wise, but there was a sense of a bit of an empty stomach, I think, if you're an Arsenal fan, or maybe if you're a neutral, unless you're a Spurs fan, for example, or a Bayern fan in that situation, because there was a sense that Arsenal had more to give and they'd maybe missed a trick. Now, this time, they've worked it out. I think you look at the way they managed that semi-final against Real Madrid, against a team that I think most people would say have better players than them. I've got a lot of friends who are Arsenal fans and spoke to them before the game, notably Jim Campbell from the Ramble, and he was saying it's just great to be in a quarter-final against Real Madrid. I think there was limited expectation. And then obviously after that first leg where Arsenal was so fantastic and Real Madrid was so caught in the headlights, it was more of a sense of, okay, Arsenal can actually do something here. And maybe this is a little bit of an epiphany for Arsenal. I think we've seen in these 2 seasons that Arsenal have been back in the Champions League that they can be a genuine contender going forward. So if we're talking about a change in the balance of power, I think Arsenal can be a force in the Champions League going forward. And of course, they will look to go out and reinforce the squad and probably get a proper centre forward, maybe Victor Gyökeres, in this summer, which again would make them a huge contender for next season's Champions League as well, no matter what happens in the remainder of this. Now, we have to mention Liverpool, of course, went out at the last 16, but I wouldn't put them amongst the losers of this season's Champions League because, look, that can just happen against PSG. I think we got a tie that really should have been a semi-final in the last 16 stage. Liverpool will get past this, even though they have a summer of semi-reconstruction. You know, they may have re-signed Mo Salah and Virgil van Dijk, of course, but certainly they've got a few little needs, notably at centre-half, maybe a new centre-forward. We'll have to wait and see what happens with Darwin. But I think they're almost an exception to this because Liverpool, before Slot, when you go back to Klopp, when you go back to Benitez, of course, for a number of seasons, they've been consistently difficult to face in the Champions League. And this aura that they have, I think, almost outlasts any other changes in the competition. Going on from that Premier League tip, I think it's quite interesting when we're talking about the changing balance of power in the Champions League, that some newer teams could be part of that. Now, Aston Villa have obviously come back into the Champions League for the first time in ages, or the first time since they dominated the European Cup in the 80s, and you have the mural on the side of Villa Park with 1982, and there's so much imagery from that final where they beat Bayern Munich around Villa Park, which is wonderful to see. Obviously, the stadium itself has been a massive addition to the Champions League. The atmosphere there is magnificent. It's so special. But as well, they've looked ready for it. Unai Emery is a huge part of that. But I think if we look at the second part of the Champions League campaign, and I think you can divide it into group stage and knockouts, the fact that they've been able to add high impact players who, as we saw against PSG, are capable of taking games away from a team in a minute. Now, look, who knows if they'll go into next season still with Marcus Rashford, still with Marco Asensio. But they've got other players who can do that as well. Ollie Watkins, who can conjure a goal from nothing. John McGinn was able to grab the ball by the horns against PSG as well. So many other players. Morgan Rogers, I think, was absolutely built for this stage, who can change a game in a minute. And whatever happens with Villa next, the fact that they have those players who can seize moments definitely makes them a threat in this going forward. The other team I think we've got to watch for is Newcastle United, who at the time of recording have got themselves into a very good spot to qualify for next season's Champions League. That would be the second time they qualified in 3. And if we're talking about the pillars of power shifting a little bit in the Champions League, the idea that new English teams, new Premier League teams, are maybe establishing themselves as regulars in that competition, I think that's quite interesting. Now, of course, when there are winners, there has to be losers as well. And there are 2 big ones, and you know who they are. Manchester City being one. I think this was a really sobering season for Manchester City. Of course, we know it has been in the Premier League, but it has been in the Champions League as well, where they've looked tactically short, they've looked physically short. Now, I guess a lot of those problems that they've had in the Premier League can be related to their performance in the Champions League as well. But their inability to manage matches, I think, really points to the fact that, and as we've seen in this winter transfer window, when they brought in Kuzanov, when they brought in Marmoush, Vitor Reis, they're clearly looking for some sort of rebuild. And of course, Kevin De Bruyne is moving on as well, having been such a star for them over the years. Whether they can get themselves in a point where they can physically boss matches and manage matches a little bit better is going to really define whether they're able to return to Champions League prominence next year. Now, Real Madrid are the other one, of course, and they're the biggest one because they are the biggest team, not just in Champions League, but in European Champion Clubs Cup history, going all the way back to the 50s when their president, Santiago Bernabeu, was a huge part in actually convening this competition in the first place. And they've got a problem here. And I think if they were just having a bad season in the Champions League, that can happen. It's a knockout competition. Even they can't win it every time. But I think the whole manner of their defeat by Arsenal said to us that maybe something's changed. Because as we said on OTC last Thursday with Jonathan Johnson and Dot Adebayo, there's just this sense that they were so beaten by a team that we expected them to be way better than, that we thought that they were way further down the line in terms of their rebuild than they actually seem to be. So you've got a situation where you've got Mbappe locked up, you've got Bellingham locked up, you've got Tchouaméni, you've got Camavinga, you've got all these players who should be the future, even Raul Asensio, who's come in and done pretty well as a centre-back this season and on occasion looked their best defender. These should be the keys to the future. But at the moment, where are they? Where are they in terms of a coach? Will Carlo Ancelotti be replaced by Xabi Alonso? We don't know. Will they continue with Vinicius Junior, who they're currently tentatively negotiating a new contract with, something we've spoke about in a previous video on the OTC YouTube channel? We don't know. Are they going to be centering the new team around Mbappe and Bellingham? Well, perhaps. But should they be? What are they going to do with their defence, which looks really creaky all of a sudden? And Trent Alexander-Arnold is a great get, but does he really change how good they are defensively? And how does he fit into this team? How do they cover his runs forward? There are so many unknowables with Real Madrid. When you go back a couple of years and you look, they already had Federico Valverde and they added gradually Camavinga, then Tchouaméni, then Bellingham. And we all thought this is a midfield that no one in Europe can live with for the next 10 years. But it turns out everything's a little bit out of kilter. And not just the next coach, but the club and their recruitment policy will need to adjust a little bit to reflect this. Can they get back to the point where they're potential winners every single season of the Champions League? Because you know what? The Arsenal tie suggested that maybe it's going to be a little bit more difficult for them. Now, if we're talking about enduring change in the Champions League, I think there are a couple of clues that suggest that maybe it could be a change that lasts for a little while. Now, we don't know what the future is with Barcelona, mainly to do with their financial issues. But with PSG, this is a young team that you sense under Luis Enrique, who has a lot of power and got an extended contract this season, that they're going to continue to develop. And players like Desiree Doué, Bradley Barcola are going to be even better next season than they were this. And maybe you could even say the same about a signing like William Pacho. And I think as well, you look at the new teams that are coming, the new clubs that are coming from the Premier League. And if Newcastle get there again, I think that will be really, really interesting. Of course, we all want to see Nottingham Forest in there as well when we're talking about the old romance of the old European Cup. That would be brilliant to see. And I think Villa have underlined that this season. But seeing wealthy, well-stocked, well-coached, in the case of Unai Emery and Eddie Howe, and well-organised teams coming into the Champions League are going to change the playing field a little bit more and maybe draw that balance of power away from Spain and back towards the Premier League. Thanks so much for joining us. As always, we're here every Monday with a reaction from usually the weekend's football before we get to the OTC podcast, which is every Thursday with me, Dotun Adebayo, and guests. Get at that on your podcast catcher of choice. We also have a podcast on Fridays, Ask OTC, where we answer your questions. So leave them here below the line or get at us on the socials. We'll see you here again next Monday.